this week. I'm told this is the last talk of this semester, so we made it. So very happy to see you guys here. So feel free to come up to the front, yeah, because the speaker is right here. So the previous recorded talk can be found on YouTube channels on our website. So if you are joining us in Zoom, which you should really come here, the question will be answered at the very end of the talk. You can then post this question. We have two panelists, Yiming Huang and Huzheng Yang, who will tabulate your questions and we answer those at the end of it. For those of us here, you can raise your hand or wait till the end of the talk to ask Phil questions. Again, the panelists are Yiming here and Huzheng. So with that out of way, so it's a great pleasure to see Phil here, finally in Philadelphia. Phil has been at MIT for several years now associate professor in EECS. I know Phil for many years since he was a student at MIT where he got his PhD, working with Ted Adelson, one of the most creative persons thinking vision. Phil also worked on a lot of projects with Oliver, which also admired quite a bit. And Phil was part of this team where worked on many things on memories, and including one project I thought was really cool, which is about by just looking at how people like the pictures, you can predict whether someone can remember this picture. Just look at the gaze. A lot of cool stuff. Phil, of course, is very well known for some of the work he did at Berkeley, where he spent many years postdocing, patiently working on things with Alicia Afros. I remember actually just dropping by the lab one day and Phil just showed me, oh, this is something cool called Pix-to-Pix. Now everyone uses Pix-to-Pix. He's also known for the work that he did at the time called Cyclogam that everybody talk about. And another work that people all know about is the perceptual distance of judging whether two pictures are the same, the Lipis measures that he created. Phil actually worked on many topics, including sort of contrast learning and some serial graphs and so on. So he have give a lot more sort of thoughts or insight to why contrast learning is working. Some of his more recent work about talking about how language and vision models are learning similar concepts. His panoptic views of large models are very, I think, insightful. So he have received many awards, Sloan Fellowship, Packard Awards, Google Research Fellowships. And Phil spent a lot of time writing and teaching. And as a result of that, he actually has a very good vision books now out there. I think probably one of the better ones. One of the problem that we have in this community is that there's a lot of development over the years, and none of us have a good book. I would just wave my hand. So look, it's too fast of development, and they can't write a book. But Phil actually did a good job, and the book's out there now, so we all can use his book, so refer to it. So I'm really happy that Phil can come over here, give a talk to us about robotics and artificial life. So welcome to Pat. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for the intro and going all the way back to the memorability. Like, yeah, it was fun to. Actually, Johnbo mentioned to me this morning that memory recognition is just contrastive learning, and I was like, wow, that's such a cool insight. And I've worked on both those, but I never saw that connection. So, yes, it's always fun to try to find these connections. Okay, so how much time should I save for the panel? Just to check. How much time for the panel at the end? Okay, whatever I feel like. Okay, good. And feel free to, this can be interactive. I don't mind if you ask questions in the middle too. So just raise your hand or shout it out. Okay, yeah, it's great to be here. I've been meaning to come visit for quite a few years, and it's good to finally be here. Okay, so I'll talk today about two different projects. I kind of stuck them together. They're going to be a bit of like a part A and a part B, but they share this. There's a common story that I'll tell. Okay, so it's going to be one project on robotics using world models, and the other one will be artificial life, trying to discover like new organisms that are simple creatures like the ones shown up here. Okay, so I want to start with this slide that I include in all of my courses. When I teach computer vision, this is like one of the first lectures that I borrowed from Alyosha Efros. And it's this idea that data can be unreasonably effective. So there's a famous paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Data, which is riffing on an earlier famous paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Math in the Natural Sciences. But the Unreasonable Effectiveness of Data paper is saying there are some areas of the world of reality that can be modeled with elegant equations. So planetary motion, how balls bounce on hard surfaces, Newtonian mechanics, these types of things, atomic physics. But there's other parts of the world that just do not admit explanation with parsimonious equations, simple rules, are just hopelessly complex. And the only recourse we have is to use big, complicated functions which have a lot of parameters and are really wiggly, and no human can write those down. So we have to learn those from data. So we have to use a data-driven approach for these parts of the world. And this might be how humans work, psychology, how the brain works. It might be the texture of bark on a tree, the genetics that led to that texture. The world is extremely complex in areas of biology, economics, psychology, sociology, and so forth. Okay, and what these authors pointed out is that for these parts of the world, data-driven methods work. This is a story they've all heard. Big data, machine learning, scaling data. This is a big thing right now. And for many tasks, once you have enough data, then it kind of forms almost like this closed set of experiences that you would encounter, and you can just reference the data. Nearest neighbors might get you there. So what I want to argue in this talk is two examples where I think we're still relying a little too much on elegant mathematics, and we might do better by embracing the data. And this is maybe a mainstream argument at this point, but it wasn't always the case. And I think it still can provoke debate, and I'm happy for people to agree or disagree. But the two parts where I think that we're still making a little bit of a mistake on relying too much on elegant mathematics and its bottlenecking us are going to be on simulation engines. And that will be the first part of the talk. So what I want to talk about is moving from classical simulation engines like this one here, MuJoCo, to world models that are learned from data. And I think in robotics, the reliance on classical simulation has maybe held us back a bit, because it turns out the world is too complex for a human to write down the equations and create a simulation engine. And maybe we should instead rely on learning. And okay, so that, yeah, instead of using MuJoCo, let's go to world models. And the other part of the talk will be people also tried to rely on beautiful, elegant, simple mathematics to explain evolution and life and come up with handcrafted fitness functions and rules of how cells and automata might evolve. And they kind of wrote it all down and tried to have a theory of how that would work. Maybe instead we need to, we can't just write this down. This is the rules for the game of life, Conway's game of life. It's a simple cellular automata. Maybe instead we can take our favorite foundation model and somehow extract a guidance signal for discovering interesting creatures from that model. And that will be the second half of the talk. Okay, so part one is going to be world models for robotics. So the gist of the argument, so first I'll say what my kind of stance is, and then I'll tell you the actual technical content. So my stance is simulation and sim to real in particular has been bottlenecked on classical simulation engines, which just are not actually complex enough and rich enough to model much of the world. And at first this might seem kind of weird, like, yeah, but we know physics really well, right? Do you want to come in, or okay, no, I'm not sure if you're here for this. Okay, but the thing is, yes, classical engines, we know how to model light and ray optics. We know how to model cameras. We know how to model maybe Newtonian physics and like how atoms move around. But these engines don't simulate the content in the first place. They don't simulate the shape of a chair. They don't simulate how the bark of the tree evolves over thousands of generations of creatures on Earth competing. So actually, MuJoCo and Unreal Engine 5 and these types of things, they're simulating a tiny, tiny fraction of the world, basically just rendering and a little bit of physics. Okay, so I think that means that they aren't able to create the diversity of content at scale that we really need in order to get sim to real to work, in order to train robots in rich simulations of the world that then can transfer to reality. However, generative models fit to videos or observations of the world potentially could create much richer simulations of the content. Okay, there is one type of classical engine, procedural graphics, that does create the content as well, but I think that that's not as powerful as modern generative models. Okay, so let's see how we can start using some generative models to create the simulation engine for robotics. I think this is one of the big ideas out there right now. And our current take on this is in this paper, Learning Visual Parkour from Generative Images. And this is work that was led by Ge and Alan, Ge Yang and Alan Yu. And I think Ge actually gave a talk on this. Hopefully my talk won't overlap too much with this. I'm adding a few new things as well. Okay. So what did we do? Well, our starting point is that we have this belief that generative world models are a new simulation engine that should be useful for training robots and agents. Initially, what I wanted to do is I wanted to just go take Sora or VO2 or whatever the latest one of these is and just use it. But it turns out that they're closed source. It's hard to make the partnerships. They're really expensive to run. And the students just said, no, we just can't do that. We have to come up with a different solution. But this is the thing that got my attention, these types of models, which, I'm sure most of you have seen these types of things, but you can now just type in a text prompt like pirate ships sloshing around in coffee, and you get these images which look like they really capture something about fluid mechanics. And I think they do. That's still an open question to what degree are these video models accurate physical world models. And my hypothesis is yes, they are. We should think of them as accurate physics models, although they're not perfect. But that's an open question. Okay, here's another one, Genie 2, where you can actually simulate the entire interactive world and play the game. There's a bunch of startups and companies like World Labs that are making these generative world models. So this is something the technology will be here, but the problem is it's not quite here yet, at least not in the open source academic community. Okay, so here is one of the versions of Sora that was released, this video model from OpenAI, and suppose you want to train a robot to ski in this environment. So this is a world model. You can interact. You can tell it, ski down the slope, and that's an action you're taking, and it will simulate the transition function, right? So video models are, simulating the transition dynamics of a world conditioned on actions, but it's not an accurate one. And if I train that robot to ski, it's going to fall over, and it won't make any sense. Okay, because you can't actually do that in reality. So how can we make some progress given that the physics are not yet accurate enough in the open source versions of these models to train robots, presumably? So we can instead look at a different type of simulation for robotics, a classical kind like MuJoCo. And these have really accurate physics for the part of physics they model. Okay, so I told you that they don't model the content, they don't model the generative process that led to the shape of the dirt and so forth. The robot's going to walk over, but they do model collisions on flat surfaces and basic geometry. Okay, so we're going to try to put those two things together. We think that MuJoCo in classical simulation is still probably the gold standard for accurate physics, but it doesn't have the diversity of content and appearance that you get in video generative models. So could we take the MuJoCo environment and rather than rendering it to look like fake computer graphics, which won't match the appearance of the real world and will cause a robot trained in the simulation to fail when it comes to the real world, which looks different. What if we instead just do this old trick of translating the appearance, image translation from this appearance to what this world would look like if it were in a courtyard at MIT? So here we extract from the MuJoCo environment a few different channels. We extract the foreground mask, the background mask, the depth map. These are all just given to you by the 3D environment. And then we put this through a image-to-image translation method called ControlNet. So it's using the generative model Stable Diffusion, conditioning it on these channels and saying, make me an image that also matches the text prompt like a courtyard at MIT at sunset. And it will draw you something like that. Okay, so that's really the whole trick of this paper is just say, you can render these physics engines, these classic simulations with generative AI methods and get more appearance realism and diversity. And I think both of those words are important, both realism and diversity. Okay, so here's what the images look like from the robot's perspectives. The robot's experience is no longer in this kind of toy MuJoCo world. Instead, it is in this flashing world of realistic frames and a little bit of realistic motion as well, because we're doing some image warping from frame to frame. We're kind of following the optical flow of the depth map. But we're flashing. Why are we flashing? Because diversity matters. This is the idea of domain randomization, that you want to train the robot to be robust against all the different possible ways the world could look, all the different visual appearances, the weather conditions, the lighting conditions, the material conditions, how shiny the ground is, if there's cobblestones and so forth. And by randomizing quite rapidly, you end up getting better results. Okay. So we train the robot on that kind of data. And as I said, one of the critical things in this project is the diversity. Yeah, let's go question.
And the idea is you're going to take this low dimensional latent space from sim and you're going to lift that up to the visual space, right, via rendering, and then have your policy trained in the higher dimensional space.
Yeah.
Well, I guess why? Why not take the high dimensional space and then cast that back down to the latent space and just operate there? Which is the sort of more classical approach.
Yeah. So like, yeah, that's a good question. I think that you could do either one. Maybe like your mileage will vary, but so you could take natural images and like project them, like do parsing, right? Like extract the depth map from them, extract the segmentation map and so forth. And here we do it, kind of the opposite way of you just train on appearances that are randomized over all of those conditions. So the policies should kind of learn to infer the depth and the segmentation, but it's not explicitly inferring them at test time. It's just amortizing that during training time. So I think this is roughly like the difference between domain adaptation and like domain randomization. So you could at test time adapt your domain or parse your image into something that looks more like the state space, like estimate the state and then operate your policy over the state space. Or you could do it the other way around, where you at training time like take the state and randomize the appearance. So I think both of them can work, and this is one easy way of doing it. Yeah, question.
The problem with simulation is not that the visual quality is not high, right? The visual quality was already high in like many previous simulators using like, classical graphic stuff. The problem is the correspondence between vision and like the physics, right? If you see grass, actually, the friction is in this way, the terrain is deformable. If you see water, like, but I'm not sure, maybe I did not understand. I don't think there is a relation between what you see and kind of what you feel.
There's not. There's only a relation here between what you see and the geometry. So what you feel, insofar as that's dependent only on the geometry, but the appearance doesn't condition on physical material properties. You could add that. That could be another channel, like the friction channel. You can condition on this as well, but we don't do that in this project. And for the locomotion robots that we're going to train, it turns out that modeling is like, we're not going to get it to walk on ice. We're going to do kind of simple walking on like normal paved paths and maybe on grass. So I think that would be interesting to condition this also in the physical properties that might affect control beyond just geometry, but we didn't do that.
Predict the friction of ice, right? I mean, that depends. Actually, the characteristic, kind of, that is the hard part, at least kind of to my view. I don't know if you agree or disagree.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how would you, so we would want a generative model that you can condition on the friction coefficient of the surface and generate accurate imagery that looks like ice if it's conditioned on it being slippery. How do you get the data to do that? How do you engineer the system? Yeah, I think that might not be trivial to get. So that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, train that deforms. Yeah, so I feel like, I guess I'll say that to me, this is like a first step in the path that I am betting on, which is learned world models. I think that probably next steps will be actually, learning the physical deformable dynamics, learning the physical material properties. This is only at the appearance level. So I think that the way to really understand this is it's like we are randomizing over lighting conditions, and those can be, and we can get natural and realistic variation from current models, just conditioning on depth and text and a few masks. So we're making a policy that's robust to lighting and kind of appearance, like material appearance, but not necessarily to the physical conditions. Yeah. Okay. So one of the key things that is important to make this work is we need to be able to create a diversity of experience. And I think this is something that maybe people also got a little bit wrong in classical sim to real robotics, although ideas like domain randomization have been around for a long time. But a lot of effort has been put into making more and more realistic simulations, but I think really you want more and more diverse experiences. Okay, so how do we get diversity with these generative models? We get it through the text conditioning. So we want to be able to render all the different ways the world could look. So we need to have some vocabulary of descriptions of all the different ways the world could look. And for that, we ask a language model. So we're going to leverage a language model, and we have a meta prompt to the language model of the form, describe to me all the different times of day. The meta prompt is, I'll illustrate with this first single prompt. A modern campus with a wooden pilo blocks in the front and center. If you do that, then you will, if you sample random images conditioned on that prompt, you'll get a few different images, but they won't have a lot of diversity. And in order to inject diversity into the system, you can modify the language prompt. So this is something that's a little bit funny about current image generative models, is that unconditional models, if you don't condition them on anything, they actually don't make that much variation. But you can introduce variation by conditioning them on variation. And so we'll condition the model instead on a bunch of different prompts. And we'll get that bunch of different prompts with a meta prompt, which asks the LLM to produce for us 1,000 descriptions of a courtyard at different times of day and different weather conditions. So the details of the meta prompt are some of this kind of prompt engineering magic. It's like, okay, generate detailed descriptions of a flight of stairs. The foreground is a stairway made of one of n materials. Select the material. So you have this prompt. And the LLM will make you as many captions for these scenes as you want. And then you condition your generator on that. And that's how you get diversity. Okay, so this meta prompt then put that through a language model, like a GPT model, and it will make thousands of different descriptions of the stairs are made of concrete, and a different description might be the stairs are made of stone, or the stairs are made of brick, and so forth. Okay, so now we get our thousands of descriptions, and that's how we get a lot of visual diversity. So changing the prompt, conditioning on the same depth map and in the same foreground and background masks, we get all those different images just by changing the language prompt, and that's automated by a language model. Okay. So that's the whole idea of the method. It's just domain randomization with a generative model, kind of updating this idea for the era of generative AI. But this project also involved a few other pieces, which I think are pretty interesting. So one of them is, how do we evaluate if our policies are successful? And for this, we also use a generative world, but it's a very different kind of generative world. Okay, so how do we evaluate? So we're going to evaluate by training these policies in simulation and testing them somewhere. And where do we test them? We test them in a digital twin of the world, not in the real world. We'll do that a little bit later. But first, we test them in another simulation, but it's not a generative, randomized, diverse world model. It's a digital twin type of world model. So it's going to be a Gaussian splatted scene. Okay, so here's another courtyard at MIT, and the team took a lot of photos and created a 3D model of that courtyard using Gaussian splatting. And now they deploy their robot policy in that world. So this is a very realistic visual appearance, very realistic geometry, not realistic physical properties. So we're not handling the physical properties beyond geometry yet, but it doesn't have a lot of diversity. But for evaluation, you really want to have realism, but not necessarily diversity, because you're not learning anything. You're just validating. You're just doing some property testing of how accurate is the model or how effective is the model. And that requires far fewer samples, far less diversity than to train a system. Okay, so to me, the kind of a good idea for simulated worlds for evaluation is to emphasize realism at the cost of diversity. And a good simulation engine for training is to emphasize diversity, maybe at the cost of realism. Okay, so we collected a bunch of these environments, and this creates a test suite where you can put your robotic policy and test them in these visually realistic, geometrically realistic environments. Okay, so here's the robot being deployed in those environments, and it's able to successfully jump over these objects and do these basic parkour tasks. And then the final thing that you do eventually want to do, but you want to do this. This is the most expensive, most realistic kind of evaluation is actually put the robot out into the real world. So of course, we actually do that as well. We deploy it on a real robot. So I'll show you those results. Okay. Yeah, Dinesh.
Maybe I missed this, but do you create Gaussian splats, then also like, when you create these Gaussian splats, then also insert your simple rigid body geometry into it so that you can actually walk over?
Oh, do you insert your
the
geometry?
Simple rigid body geometry of the block and the cone and everything onto it so that you have reasonable dynamics for the quadruped to walk over? Because I can't imagine how you otherwise get,
So you get the geometry from the Gaussian splat, you get a mesh.
Yeah.
And then from the robot's perspective, so the simulation engine is that's the mesh that you're using, and the robot's being simulated on that world. Yeah, exactly. Okay. For the final comparison, I'll show a comparison to classical domain randomization. So classical domain randomization is on the left, and that is I have just hard-coded up some rules for how the world might vary in appearance, and I want to create a visual policy that is robust to all those changes. And on the right, we have greater realism, but also greater diversity. I think to me, it's really about the greater diversity. Like here, the background can be different colors and a few different textures, but here the background can be, much, much more diverse, okay? In terms of diversity in some perceptual appearance space, it's going to be much higher on the right side. Okay, so does that actually help? Is that actually a good idea? So here is some results. The policy trained only in simulation. It's an RGB policy, so it only observes RGB colors, and it has to do this parkour task, this walking task. And if you train it with domain randomization and then deploy it 0-shot into the real world, it's never seen a real image, it fails. But if you use this generative domain randomization, then it works in this case. And so in the paper, there's some numbers. Basically, yes, it does better. Okay, a few more. Yeah, so success there. So to conclude this part of the talk, the picture that I have in mind is that we have a really great recipe that's been super successful in the land of chatbots and language models, and that is the pre-train, post-train recipe. And I think the big lesson from those models is that you don't need to, you train your system in 2 phases on 2 types of data. The first phase is you train a massive, massive data of low quality. Just download the whole internet and fit the internet. And there was an era, I was previously working in the era when we thought that was a bad idea. Like you need to have really well-labeled correct data sets. You need to make these annotated benchmarks, ImageNet and COCO. And then people said, wait a second, what if you just train on random photos from the internet with random labels of whatever people type on the internet? Seems like a terrible idea, but that is the pre-training phase, and that works really well. And the idea is that you're training a kind of a multitask system on really diverse data, so it can kind of get to understand all the different scenarios it might encounter. But you don't want the system then to talk to you like a random person on the internet, so you have the post-training phase. And I think we can make this analogy to robots where I would see it maybe evolving in a similar way. We have a pre-training phase, which could be download the internet, collect that data, learn kind of basic foundation models, and additionally train your robots in this pre-training phase on randomized diverse worlds, which emphasize diversity over realism or quality. And then the post-training phase, you want it to be more like curated, targeted, safe, correct, unbiased data. In language models, this is reinforcement learning from human feedback and reasoning and so forth. In robotics, I think that what might make more sense there is to use these digital twins, like really good copies of the world, or actual deployment onto the real robot, and then fine-tune the model and correct it and evaluate it and hyperparameter fit it in these much more expensive simulations. Okay. So let me just give you a preview of what's coming next in this project. So we really want to be able to insert humans and demos and imitation learning into these virtual worlds that we're creating. And so what Go and the team are doing next is creating a way of putting humans into the system via VR and AR goggles. So here's a Vision Pro, and what she's doing is she is having her hands tracked and demonstrating some policy about moving a cube around. And the kind of interesting difference between this system and some of the existing ones is everything is done on device. So you don't need to upload your data to some server which has latency problems. You can manipulate an object, and the computation is happening on device, and the speed is, just the speed of light between your head and your hands. Okay, so there's some other systems that try to do demo collection in VR, but they upload to a server that then will do the simulation on the server, and that introduces a few milliseconds of latency, which make it hard to control like dynamic objects. Here's another example of this setup. So now this Adam, the student, is embodying this robotic hand. He's controlling the hand in VR, and he's opening. You can see the pass-through a little bit in the background. He's demoing what it would be like to open this dishwasher. Okay, and this is all just hot off the presses. This is a video the team sent me just this morning. So this, hopefully we'll have more to share on this soon. But now we're adding this generative augmentation and rendering within the VR world that the human is interacting with. So the human gives a demo of how to control this gripper to pick up the orange that was there in the middle, and then we augment that with all of our generative rendering techniques. And yeah, to me, the kind of big picture is let's insert humans into generative world models and collect data in those systems. Okay. If you're interested in this line of work and the tools and being able to get Oculus Quest or Vision Pro and start collecting robot data on it, Go has this open source platform called Viewer that allows you to do that. You can also teleop your robots with the same technology. Okay. Okay. Questions, and then I'll go into the artificial life part. Yeah.
The quality of the geometry that you get with the 3D Gaussian splats, because in the video that you shown with the legged robot, there was a lot of interpretation between like feet and geometry, and I wonder if that is a problem of the contact model or of the geometry being not accurate.
That's a good question. So I think that's more the contact model and the simplifications that are made when actually putting this into MuJoCo and creating collision bodies. And some of those simplifications are by design, because if you actually use the true grass geometry and the grass doesn't have the physics accurately modeled, then it's going to be like this really spiky surface you're walking over. Gaussian splatting itself can get quite accurate geometry of grass. So I don't think it's the Gaussian splatting, it's the inserting that into a simplified collision mesh in MuJoCo. Okay, any other questions? And then I'll move on, and we can come back to this in the panel too. Okay, so part two is, so I think what I've talked about so far is actually fairly mainstream. It's a bet that I'm making, but I think a lot of the community is making it. Generative world models as a new simulation engine for training robots. And I think this is like a baby step. So we're just adding this, domain randomization with these models right now. Okay, but now I want to move to something a little bit different and a little more out there, and that is artificial life. And so my argument will be that artificial life has been also bottlenecked by some elegant mathematics and hand-engineered systems. And this has been the design of fitness functions and the design of particular life forms that are kind of hard-coded, like Game of Life, for example. And I think what unfortunately might turn out to be the case is that there is no simple equation that you can write down that will guide you toward interesting, creative, open-ended behavior. This is something that a few other people like Jeff Clune have been giving talks on recently. I think he's quite right about this, that for years, the people in the artificial life and open-endedness community have tried to come up with a mathematical measure of what it means to be novel or interesting or good behavior, and it just hasn't worked. And it might be that the notion of interestingness, the notion of novelty, is something that can only really be fit with a very complicated function. It's a very complicated thing. It's like the bark of a tree that's evolved over millennia, and we need to rely on data to define that. So it's like you know it when you see it. You can't define what interestingness is. You can only know it when you see it. Okay. But we now have systems that can see and know things and have common sense or have been pre-trained on the internet. And we have vision recognition models, and they can look at behavior and say, does it look interesting? You can just ask them. We can ask them a language model. So I think some folks here are doing this more with asking a language model. Is this interesting? Is this good behavior? So here's one example from Dinesh and Jason Ma and others here. So I think you're all, a lot of you in the audience will be familiar with this idea. But I think it's super cool. It's that if we we might not be able to do reward engineering to create just the right fitness function, just the right reward function for training our robots. But maybe an LLM can. Maybe an LLM can write actual code that will run in MuJoCo or some other simulation engine and check if behavior is good or bad. And a human engineer would have a lot more trouble doing that. So we're actually going to use a similar idea. Ours is a little bit more like this other paper from Carl Vondruk's group and Ryoshi Liu at Columbia. And there's a few other people, like this is a broad idea right now. So there's a bunch of groups that are doing this. But what they did is they just say, I want to train a robot by having the reward function for the robot, guiding the robot's behavior be just a camera that looks at what the robot is doing and says, is it doing the thing I want it to do? So you can just look at the thing and say, I'll type in, I want it to pick up an apple. And then the VLM that looks at the camera's image will look, did it pick up an apple? And it knows how to interpret that because these recognition systems are good enough at this point. Okay, so they have that example over here, a robot doing X. You can just ask the system, is this a robot doing X? And that's your reward function. Okay, so we used a similar technique, but we applied it to this domain of artificial life to create what we call like life forms like these. Okay, and this is work that we put out a few months ago. And this was led by my student Akarsh Kumar. So he's down here. And it was in collaboration with Sakana AI, which is an AI company in Japan, with David Ha and Ken Stanley and Yujin Tong and Louis Kirsch and Chris Liu were the other co-authors. Okay, so artificial life, what is that? I mean, this is actually something that's not a super popular topic, so I need to introduce the basic idea. So artificial life says, let's understand the process that led to the complexity of life on Earth. And one of the key characteristics of this process is that it's what we might want to call open-ended. So evolution is like there was one initial condition and then one run. Philosophically, you could imagine maybe there's actually like a million parallel universes and like there's also a lot of different runs of evolution and we just like live in the one where it actually worked out. But there's a procedure that went from the Big Bang to us, and it's just like one thread of physical evolution according to the laws of the universe. And somehow that led to all this diversity. And if you keep on running that for another billion years, presumably there'll be even more diversity. Maybe humans will destroy ourselves. That could happen. But then Martians will pop up. And then the rats will come and they'll rise up and create a civilization. Okay, so we haven't seen this system fail so far, and maybe it will continue. And so artificial life tries to understand this process, but it also tries to go a little bit beyond it. It's not just biology. It's not just evolutionary biology. It's actually trying to imagine not life as it is, but life as it could be. What is the space of all possible systems that lead to what we might call life or open-endedness or creative evolution? Okay, so what would an alien life form look like? Can we actually understand that? Can we make a mathematical framework for understanding that? Can we simulate that? Can we create that? Go create new life forms. So a really cool area. But unfortunately, progress in this area has not been very rapid. I think that the most impressive piece of work in artificial life is John Conway's Game of Life, which was done 1960s or a long time ago. So if you're not familiar, this is just like the coolest little mathematical thing to play with and understand. It's a 2D grid. Cells can be on or off, and it's an automata. So that means there's simple rules for deciding when to turn a cell on or off based on the neighbors around the cell. So if there's a lot of neighbors, then the cell dies because it's like outcompeted. If there's no neighbors, then the cell dies because it's too lonely and doesn't have, it's just a rule. And if there's like just the right number of neighbors, then the cell like replicates. Okay, or turns on. And these simple rules end up leading to all kinds of emergent complexity. So one of the simple creatures you get is this glider. It's like a self-propagating object that evolves according to these rules, but looks like a little flying animal. And you can actually, this system is actually Turing complete. So any computational structure can be implemented. So any life form could actually be simulated in Game of Life. And here's a life form that's like a spaceship flying across this world and exhausting all these little particles out. You can get self-replicators. You can get like creatures that actually are trained machines and write code and read code. So you can get all kinds of cool things. Okay, so that was the first big landmark to me in artificial life. The second big landmark was Carl Sim's 1994 paper, where he went beyond just 2D grids, but actually to 3D virtual creatures. And this is, to me, like the most impressive evolved creatures I've seen so far, even to me more impressive than the ones that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years. A few people have tried to replicate and extend this, but somehow Carl got it just right. And he evolved these creatures with some reward function, like move as quickly as possible. There was also a competitive reward function, which was try to outcompete another creature to get a block. And with some clever hacking, he was able to get it to work really well. Okay, so these are some of the cool things in artificial life, but there's a lot more. People have created like art forms, like these creatures. But all of this is very hand engineered. You needed to have John Conway come up with just the right equations. You need to have Carl Sims write a lot of he was a computer graphics by training, and he had to get all of the dynamics just right and create this simulation engine such that actually you got emergent interesting behavior. Okay, and so it's turned out to be hard for people to create more examples of equal quality. So we want to automate this process, and we want to just search over the space of possible simulation rules and try to find a set of rules that will come up with interesting creatures. And we can't mathematize what it means to be an interesting creature, so we'll just ask an LLM. That's the basic idea. Okay, so we're actually going to just ask a vision language model, or vision model, really. We'll ask the model, make me a snake. And so it will search over possible simulation rules until it finds one that makes something that appears to that model as a snake. Okay, so we're just going to ask a foundation model, really simple. Maybe unsatisfying. I think you can ask yourself whether this kind of work is satisfying or not, but at least I think it works, which is a starting point. So here's the basic idea on one slide, and then I'll go into some of the details. So we have a configuration of the simulation. This could be like the rules of the game of life or the rules of the environment. There's a bunch of different like substrates, automata and like continuous version of automata called linear. And then we run the simulation. It creates a movie. We put that movie into a vision model, and then the vision model outputs some kind of score about how well that movie matches some criteria that we can specify. Okay, so here are a few of the examples of the kind of creatures that are found, but let me walk through 3 different methods for doing that search. The first is going to be what we call supervised target. Supervised target is we have our space of possible simulations, space of possible update rules for how the life evolves, how the creatures, the automata evolve. We parameterize that space with parameters theta, and we will have this function rs, which is going to run the simulation. So running the simulation means just step the simulation forward with the parameters theta, render it to images, and you create a video. Okay, so this creates a sequence of frames, and we're going to try to maximize to find a sequence of frames parameterized by the simulation rules theta that a vision language model will find to be a match to a textual prompt. So this is a VLM, this is clip, which is able to check if some text is aligned with some image. So if some image matches some text. So this is just run independently on each of the frames. It's not actually looking at the temporal dynamics. It's just independently on each of the frames. And we can then create a search, which will try to go toward an image that looks like a cell, or go toward an image that looks like 2 cells, or an ecosystem. And we could even do this in a sequence and try to go from 1 cell to 2 cells. Okay, yeah.
Parameters that you're optimizing over the rules of
the rules of the system, and so the parameters we're optimizing over the rules of the system that will depend on the system. In game of life, that will be this table of rules for how to turn on and off cells depending on the local neighborhood. So it's like a convolutional kernel, basically. In one of the examples, we search over the initialization, but in some of them, the initialization is like very high dimensional, hard to search over. So we just take a random initialization. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, if you're not familiar, CLIP is going to be the main model that we work with. It is simply trained to associate an image caption with an image. So it's trying to be able to, so you can check, does the image when I extract the features, have the same feature vector as the caption when I extract the features from the caption. Okay, so clip is just checking if some text string matches some produced image. Okay. So let's look at what that does to this system called Linea. So Linea is like Game of Life, but it's continuous. It's continuous automata, and it has higher dimensional state space. So the state space is color, not just black and white. And it's continuous numbers. And now we can put in a text prompt. I want to make a creature that looks like a multi-celled organism, or I want to make a creature that looks like a network of neurons, or a caterpillar. So what happens? Okay, so it's a continuous generalization of Game of Life. And we're going to search over, in this case, both the initial state and also the dynamics. And here's what happens. So when you run the system, it is trying to make, it's being optimized to make an image that looks like the text prompt, that looks like it matches the text prompt. Okay, so here's my neural net. Here's my caterpillar, right? Okay. So here's another example. So this one is another type of life simulation called Boids. It's another classic one where you have a flock of birds or Boids whose dynamics are their heading and like their velocity is a function of their neighbors. So they tend to, like they flock. If my neighbors all going in some direction, I'll try to go in the same direction as them. But you can actually change those rules. You can say, I want to repel from my neighbors. I want to go in different directions. I don't know if anybody here has read this book, Bradenburg Machines. I bet Dinesh has. Yeah. Anyone else? Bradenburg Machines? It's a really lovely, like...
Vehicles.
Oh, vehicles. Yeah, vehicles. Yeah, the Bradenburg vehicles. Yeah. Or the book might be titled Vehicles. And it talks about how like just changing the little rules of how you behave based on your neighbors and stimuli around you, you can get very diverse types of flocking and grouping and chasing and predator-prey dynamics. And so this is basically a substrate, a simulation environment in which you can get all those types of behaviors. It's a little bit like the vehicles world. Although vehicles is a thought experiment, it goes beyond this too. And then I can optimize to find a spiral. It got circles, not quite a spiral, but close enough. I can optimize to find a snake. It finds these bodies. I can optimize to find a cell. It looks actually like a cell wall and like internal structures. Okay. So let's look at one more. This is just another artificial life substrate. And the story is roughly the same as what I've said so far. So here it's a little harder to see, but these things are turning into, oh, sorry. One more? Okay, yeah, these are going to turn into caterpillar images. Okay, yeah, there it goes. And this is kind of like a cool network of neurons, like action potentials going all over the place. Okay. So that was one thing you can do. You just type in the thing you want to see, and you find the rules that lead to that thing. I want to see a civilization of humans thriving, and you create humans, and it does the whole thing. Like that's the future vision of this. You just say, I want a utopia of humans, and it just creates it. Obviously, we're not there yet. Okay. Another cool thing you can do is called illumination. Illumination is, I'm not going to search for creatures that match some text prompt. I'm just going to try to search for all the different types of creatures that could exist. So I will parameterize my space of simulations. I'll render all the simulations, and I'll optimize for maximizing the diversity, so maximizing the distance between the visual features of one creature parameterized by theta and the visual features of another creature's behavior parameterized by another theta. And I'll just try to maximize that. So I'm trying to kind of span the space of possible visually diverse behaviors that it could get, visually diverse creatures that it could get. So in this like space of image features, I'm just trying to push everything apart. Okay. Cool. So yeah, the green lines are like the maximization repelling force that we're optimizing. Okay, so here's what it looks like. And this algorithm is called illumination. So it's actually an algorithm that's out there in this open-endedness community. It's a quality diversity algorithm. You try to make things that are interesting or high quality, but also as diverse a set of as possible. And here's what it finds when run on Linea. So it finds, here's all the different visually diverse ways that linear creatures could look. Here's a bunch more. You can run it with, yeah, there we go. However big a set of samples you want. And you could also take all of those creatures that have been found, run tsne or UMAP in this case to create a kind of an organization and put them on a grid where similar creatures are next to each other. And you'll find this kind of interesting atlas of the space of linear creatures that could evolve. Okay. The website has animations that are a bit smoother, so sorry on Zoom it looks a little bit choppy, but it's not actually, that's just an artifact. Okay, we can do this with Boids too. Here's like the illumination of all the different things that all the different simulation rules that could lead to different behaviors of Boids. You could have flocking, you could have chasing, you could have all these different things. And you could get a lot of them. We could also make this atlas visualization. And here we have like, in this region are the kind of uniform, the case where the Boids don't like each other, they'll kind of spread out as much as possible. And over here are like the cases that are like these, maybe like a flock of geese or something that they follow each other in lines and strands and tendrils and V shapes. And over here are the Boids that like form cliques, like, you've the high school students and there's like the jocks and the nerds and whatever, and they all sit at different tables, but they like each other. So you get all these different interesting behaviors. Just to check, like, did it matter which visual features we use? We could use clip. What if we use a different one like dino? And what if we don't use any visual features? We just use the raw pixels as our representation of the behavior. Okay, so here's what the evolution looks like under dino features. It's pretty similar to clip. And under raw pixels, you actually end up getting, it's not a very meaningful feature space. And so when you try to find as diverse as possible things in pixel space, you just get kind of random, like it's almost like it goes to white noise, but subject to the constraints of the simulation. Okay, yeah.
What is the measure? So are you still using a measure of interestingness or quality here to also guide the search, or is it literally just quality?
Just diversity only, no quality measure. Yeah, so the quality is maximize the difference between the visual features in the grid. Yeah. Okay. And so the last one we looked at is what we call open-endedness. That's illumination already got at some diversity measure, but now we're going to look at maximizing the diversity of the time series. So as time evolves, we want each frame to look as different as possible from all the previous frames. So it's like really getting at this question of, can we optimize for life forms that continuously change? Okay, the way we do that is it's almost the same equations, but now we're going to maximize the difference between frame t and frame t plus 1, essentially. Okay, so we're kind of pushing everything apart, but pushing it away from the previous iterates of the simulation. Okay, so here we are going to test this on Game of Life. And if you look at Conway's Game of Life, it actually is not super open-ended according to this notion. Because most of the time when you start with a random configuration, Conway's Game of Life kind of plateaus and dies. So if you've played with this system, like it's really hard to get them to actually like continuously do interesting stuff. At some point, they just kind of die. But there are modifications of the Game of Life rules that have more open-endedness in this sense. So here's one that just kind of goes on forever, but always is doing something a little bit new, or that's what it's trying to do something a little bit new. This is the most open-ended model in clip feature space. And this is the most open-ended model in pixel space, which again just finds white noise, because pixel space is not a meaningful space to measure interestingness. You have to ask a foundation model. Okay, so just showing that in like a UMAP visualization of the evolution. So these trajectories are showing how the features evolve through these time series. And Game of Life is, which one is Game of Life? Game of Life, I think, is the blue one. And the most open-ended is the green one. And a random non-open-ended one is the red one. So we find an automata that's more open-ended in this sense than Conway's Game of Life. So Conway didn't get it right. He got something pretty good, but not the most interesting one. So yeah, I should get around to wrapping up, but I want to mention one or two other interesting things about this scenario. I think one interesting thing is artificial life as a field has been very qualitative. It hasn't had good quantitative measures, and I think that's held it back. Being able to quantify diversity in feature space, open-endedness of the time series in feature space, the degree to which you match target sentences or assessments according to language models or according to vision models. These give you quantities that you can optimize and measure. And so you can also use this to kind of understand the space. You can navigate linearly between the parameters that create the parameters that create these Boids here and the parameters that create these Boids here. And the interesting thing is that in between, you get a lot of parameters that create uninteresting behavior. So we have this sparse distribution. The space of simulations that lead to interesting behavior is very sparse. And if you linearly interpolate between them, there's not like linear mode connectivity like you might have in some other domains. And you can quantify that because you can just ask, what is the similarity to this starting point? And what is the similarity to this starting point in orange? What is the similarity to this starting point in blue? And you see that very rapidly, when you move away from one of the modes of interesting behavior, it falls off to like zero similarity. Okay, so we have a few other examples of kind of quantifying this stuff in the paper. I don't think I have time to go into that. So just check the paper if you want more kind of analysis of what types of life are discovered and how you can quantify that. And I would encourage you to, if you're interested in this stuff, like try writing your own physics engine, like a simulation engine, and then search over the parameterizations of that engine and see what kind of life forms you can discover. So Karsh wrote this one. It's a new one that he calls particle life plus. And it just finds really interesting things. And in this one, what he did is he took particle life, which has constant colors of each particle, and they interact with each other depending on the colors. And he made it so the color can change. Okay, so the color can update according to some dynamics rule. And that's a parameterized dynamics rule. And unfortunately, the zoom is making these animations not look that interesting. But here's one where you get this kind of static foam stuff, and then eventually it collapses into these little eggs, and then they burst and they explode and they generate new life. And it's like, you get really interesting dynamics. Okay, so go to the website. The movies look cooler on the website. Here's one interesting one where you can take a bunch of different creatures that have been illuminated by the illumination search and then break down the walls in between these worlds and let them start interacting. And we can say which creatures are going to proliferate, how are they going to interact? And like, this creature is invading this other flock. And this one here kind of became symbiotic. It's like the mRNA got injected into there and started like integrating with the DNA of that cell. I don't know. It's like these interactions between multiple agents, I think, are really interesting. So this is just a fun demo. We haven't done anything very scientific here, but I think multi-agent interactions between different life forms would be a fun next step. So I guess to kind of put these two projects together and go back to this big picture, I kind of think that this recipe of pre-trained, post-trained is a really nice paradigm in my opinion. And I think that a lot of the really interesting things we've wanted to do, like open-ended evolution and artificial life and household robots and dexterous manipulation and creative agents, we've tried in the past maybe to go directly to making those algorithms, but I think there's a prereq, and the prereq was to have these foundation models, have a really good, rich simulation of the world, and classic engines just don't cut it, have a really good perceptual representation that can identify things like interestingness, and equations don't cut it, and to have common sense and other types of foundation models. And once you have those, I think you can potentially unlock very quickly and take classical algorithms and classical ideas about novelty and just put them on top of these systems, and suddenly it works, and suddenly it does something interesting. So I'm a big believer in the whole foundation model paradigm, that you start with that foundation and then it unlocks a lot of interesting behavior and makes the rest of intelligence a lot easier. Okay, so I'll end there, and thanks to the team, Ge and Alan, who led the first project, and Akarsh, who led the second project, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, there were a couple questions, I think, online also. Want to kick off?
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. That was a really, really interesting talk, and the work on artificial life is very, very creative and interesting. I was wondering whether you thought of that work in particular as beyond the ability to generate really interesting behaviors. Are you thinking of this as a way to uncover rules that might be actually operating in nature in some way? There's kind of I don't know if you're familiar with the work of like Stephen Wolfram in this vein, right? Like this a new kind of science text book that he wrote now maybe like 25 years ago that essentially talks about this kind of automata as a way of identifying how the world works.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Yeah, can we somehow learn something about the actual world, like biology, cells, physics? So I think we're pretty far from that, but that's definitely part of the inspiration. Like, if this can, I'll be super happy if this can shed light on evolution or biology. I think one thing that might be interesting is, and we're heading toward now is, yeah, we would like to be able to train models on DNA and cellular dynamics and all this type of stuff, but it's really hard to get that data. And what is the, what is the right toy model, toy world to investigate that kind of stuff? And maybe this is a good candidate for, if we study game of life and understand how you can model game of life, maybe this will be deployable into a lab that's actually studying bioinformatics or something like that. But I would say there's still quite a few more years for that to pan out.
Nice. Thanks for the talk. It was really inspiring. I have a kind of similar question to Dinesh. So I want to push back a little bit on this kind of data-driven paradigm. So the question is, so in all of these examples, we always know the image has all of the information we need to do whatever we want to do. And if we have a good model to encode and decode, et cetera, we can do all these things. But so at some point, someone had to come up with the idea that, friction is important, or maybe your motor commands are important, or maybe, there's some kind of reward concept in this kind of fitness landscape. Like all these concepts, they had to be kind of devised at some point, maybe mathematically modeled. And I think most of these things are now kind of abstracted away by just using this model. And do you think that there's some way that we can devise like these concepts? Like if in 100 years, are we actually going to learn like new concepts about these problems, or are we just going to have a model that just does like a top-down?
Yeah.
Do you kind of get what I mean?
I think I kind of get it. Yeah, I think it's a great question. Like, to what degree can we just, throw up our hands and stop thinking and just let data scale and everything else can be emergent from that? And to what degree is actually like, do you need human cleverness and derivation and logic inserted into the system to guide it, and realize that a fundamental missing thing, maybe like in this case, we looked at every frame independently to guide the artificial life, but how would that system know that actually you could do even better if you look at adjacent frames and you model the dynamics and you look at the video? And that's not in the kind of search space of this automation. And so I think that's true. Like we kind of define the boundaries of the, we have an automation that's going to try to automate something, and we're going to define the boundaries of what you're searching over and what you're automating over. And it'll only be able to automate within those boundaries. And you'll still need external influence and humans or other algorithms to come in to tell you when to change the rules of the game. So yeah, I think of this that way. Like you set up the rules of the game. The rules of the game are, we have this substrate and we'll just search over parameters theta. But who defined parameters theta? Okay, maybe it's going to be a meta optimization problem. That's fine too. Maybe eventually, yes, we'll just talk to our super intelligent computers and say, solve biology for me, and it will just do it. That's possible. I think that's quite possible, but we're definitely not there yet. And until we're there, we still have a job, and we can still apply elegant equations and math and principles, but at this meta level instead, in terms of the optimization algorithm, the rules of the game, the framework, the hypothesis space, and so forth.
I have one last bit of a question, maybe slightly at a higher level. So I think what you're really trying to show is that the randomness of the data in the large language model is quite powerful. It's something beyond what we can reason about. Somehow in a random search, you can seek in that root space and find something reasonable. So this suggests the dimension of this data seem to be much higher than we can imagine, and somehow the large language model foundation is getting there for us.
Yeah.
The second part of you trying to say you can recognize when you see it is also very interesting, because you're saying basically NP hard is hard to optimize, but it's easy to check. Right. So it's a lot easier to check a solution than but there's sort of a slightly gap in there, which is sometimes when I see a evolution of the results, I can see something that's not what I wanted, but there's still something reasonable. And how do I intersect that sort of reasonableness and then feed back to the initial rule changes? Is the thoughts?
Yeah.
Right now, it's kind of you try to compute something random and to check if it's correct, but can we iterate it between the two?
Yeah, I think I love this framing. So verification is easier than generation for a lot of like NP hard problems, for example. And I think that's like one of the fundamental principles that's driving this whole area of reasoning, right? So people in language models now do reasoning where they have a a verifier. It could be a formal verifier, or it could just be another LLM or some judge. And the judge's problem is a lot easier than the problem of coming up with the solution in the first place. The judge just checks if the solution is something desirable or not. And so all these reasoning algorithms work basically that way. They search for solutions, and then they judge them. And then when the judge finds a good solution, it will reinforce that behavior, and it'll say that was a good train of thought or a good trace. And so what I showed here is something, well, I didn't tell you the algorithm for search. The algorithm was evolution strategies, CMA evolution strategies. But it's a very, a fairly naive, like brute force kind of search. Like try a random thing. If it satisfies your verifier, then move in that direction. If not, discard it, move on. But I think like being able to have the verifier, if it's a VLM, like actually say, oh no, the snake was not long enough. You should make a longer snake, and feed that back in and do this much more interesting iterative reasoning process that could be a lot more powerful. So I think it's just a really cool open area.
Cool. Yeah. I would just say this is a really cool results in the era of everyone trying to fine tune large models. I think this is refreshing to see that we're not just fine tuning another big model, but trying to figure out how to think about the space of exploration much more clearly. So yeah, so this is the end of our talk today and the end of the semester. So big applause to the speaker, and
Thank you.
So there's a couple of closing mark at his read. It says, please stay tuned for the fall 2025, if we make that far to the grad seminar. And for the more information, please follow us online. Right. Thank you.
Thanks.